This program is a presentation of UCTV for educational and non-commercial use only.
Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Ajit Varki. I'm the co-director of the UCSD SOC Center for Academic Research and Training in Anthropogeny. And Rusty Gage, my co-director here from the SOC, sends his regrets for not being here, for his unavoidably detained elsewhere. And Margaret Schoninger will join us shortly. Now, you may be wondering what anthropogeny is. It's actually a very old term, more than a century old, that we have sort of resurrected, and it specifically relates to the investigation of the origin of humans. So our mission statement is as follows: to use all rational and ethical approaches to seek all verifiable facts from all relevant disciplines in a transdisciplinary way, to explore and explain the origins of the human phenomenon, while doing something that humans seem to do all the time, trying to minimize complex organizational structures and hierarchies and avoiding unnecessary paperwork and bureaucracy. In other words, our goals are primarily intellectual. Now, I have to give very special thanks to our major sponsors of the symposium, the G. Harold and Leila Y. Mathers Charitable Foundation, New York. Jim Handelman, the director, is here. And to Annette Merle-Smith, and they're supposed to sit in the front row, the special seats, and they're sitting up in the back there. I also have a very special privilege today of having a special guest of honor who we only managed to get on board after we printed the program. And so I'm very pleased to invite Dr. Bill Brody, the new president of the Salk Institute, to say a few words.
Thank you, Ajit. Many people know or think they know what anthropologists do. They may know what people in the arts communities do. But if you ask many people what scientists do, they just think about test tubes, but that's about it. And one of the exciting things about science and discovery today is that the things that are going on in test tubes actually have direct relevance to fields outside that. And the idea that we could have an assembly of geneticists, neuroscientists, anthropologists, people from the music and arts community all talking together about a common theme was unthinkable. But it is the thinkable today, and I think it's exciting. CARTA has been going on for, 10 years or so, but it's been mostly meetings, closed meetings with various people from the fields of specialists talking to one another. And I thank Jim Handelman, who from the Mathers Foundation, who pushed the idea that this really ought to be opened up to the public, and I really support that. So I think we're all in for an exciting treat, and I think we're in for many years of this kind of excitement, seeing what goes on in scientific laboratories coupled with things that are of interest to all of us. So thank you for coming, enjoy the symposium, and best wishes.
Thank you, Bill. Now it's my pleasure to briefly introduce the chair of the symposium, Jean-Pierre Changeau, who's from the Institut Pasteur. He's here on a visiting sabbatical both with the Skaggs School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences, the Kavli Institute, and with CARTA. Not only is he a renaissance man in molecular neuroscience, but he's also a great appreciator and collector of art. Jean-Pierre is member of about all the academies you can think about on both sides of the Atlantic, and his achievements would go into pages. So I'll simply introduce him to chair the symposium. Jean-Pierre.
Thank you very much, Ajit, for this very kind introduction. And first of all, Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for the courage, the audace, and the insight you had to organize a symposium, The Evolutionary Origin of Art and Aesthetics. And I wish to say that this is one of the most fascinating kind of topics one may imagine. And for several reasons. First of all, because the conviction is that artistic activity is something which would escape or resist to scientific investigation ever. And I hope you are going to be convinced that this is something which is not true, and that indeed art may be available to scientific examination. The second challenge I would like to say is that in addition we have to negotiate the notion that artistic activity can be examined within the framework of evolution. And this is of course a challenge that we have to meet and to try to decide what is properly human, what is already present in humans, how does it develop throughout child development, but of course throughout evolution in the proper sense during the past millenniums or millions of years. So this is of course, as I say, a challenge, but I don't think you are going to expect any definitive scientific answer to this question. But I hope that at the end of this symposium, you shall have the notion that this is indeed a solid program of research for the next decades. And this will be possible because I think we have different disciplines interacting on this important program. And I think CARTA, thanks to Professor Barkey, has been specially organized, as he said, to meet this kind of exchange, encounter, and I hope progress in the knowledge of this theme on the evolutionary origin of art and aesthetics.
Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, of course, I want to express my thanks for the organizers of this meeting, the directors of CARTA and Jean-Pierre Changeux for inviting me here. It's always a great pleasure for me to come in San Diego. I feel a little bit unfavorized after the previous speakers and the one who is going to follow me, because as you'll see, there is very little evidence of Neanderthal art. But the nice thing about little evidence in paleoanthropology and archaeology is that when there is little evidence, there is a lot of literature. And I think I've been able to put together something about Neanderthal art. It's a bit difficult for me to speak in general about art, and I think in the course of my speech I'll try to tackle some of the issues that has been already evoked by other speakers, like aesthetics, symmetry, and symbolism. And maybe this is the kind of issues we can discuss about Neanderthals. So just before I start with the production of the Neanderthals, I want to say a few words about what are the Neanderthals. And actually, this is where probably I would be more expert, as I'm a paleoanthropologist. I'm used to work with fossils like this one. If we look at the phylogenetic tree of human evolution during the last 2 million years, we see that we have several species, and in the course of the last 500,000 years, the main story is the separation of two lineages. One African lineage, which is going to lead to our direct ancestors, the modern humans, and another lineage which is parallel to this one, which emerged in Eurasia and which gave birth to the Neanderthals. And the Neanderthals are extremely interesting from an evolutionary point of view because they share many features with us. They are large hominins with a big brain. They have many aspects of their biology which is close to us, but they are different. And they are the last split point on the evolutionary tree of humans, and this, I think, is what makes them so interesting, because anything we say about the Neanderthals, somehow it's something we say to define ourselves. The Neanderthals, as I said, evolved in Eurasia, and this is more or less their geographical distribution. We know no Neanderthal in Africa. Neanderthals, I mean, the Neanderthal lineage is known somewhere between 400,000 and 30,000, and we find them associated with lithic assemblages that we call Acheulean. So these lithic assemblages where we find these nice hand axes like the one Jean-Pierre Changeux showed a while ago. But most of the Neanderthals are associated with what we call Middle Paleolithic or Mousterian industries. I'm not going to enter this aspect. There are a lot of fantasies about Neanderthals, and this is almost inevitable because, as I said, Neanderthals are our sister group. And it's very difficult to be objective about our sister group. So as you see here, there are many ways to see the Neanderthals. In past, there was a way that was a bit brutish, like this one. But today, I must say, there is an opposite trend developing, which is to humanize the Neanderthals as much as possible, which I think it's as much exaggerated as the previous one. For some of my colleagues, I'm afraid Neanderthals are just sort of funny Eskimos who lived 60,000 years ago, and so they had bad luck because there was no computers and no internet. But if they would have, they would be here, they would probably give the talk about art. I think one of the main difficulty is that we have really a problem in conceiving humans that would not be completely humans. And of course, we know that in the last 6 or 7 million years, there was probably something like 15 or 17 different species of hominins. And these different species of hominins had all some pieces of humankind, but none of them were like us. And this is the whole challenge of paleanthropology. This is a slide for Kevin, the student that was waiting for me here in San Diego. This is also something to continue on the mode of the fantasies about Neanderthals. It's a bone with 2 holes that has been described in the literature as a flute. And so people have described this object like the demonstration for the production of music by Neanderthals. Later, it was proved that it's a juvenile femur of bear with 2 holes which have been likely made by the teeth of another bear. And but the fact is that it's possible to produce some kind of music with that, and there are people who have been really good at doing that. But I also heard people playing symphonies with a bottle of Coca-Cola, and so I'm not very impressed by this kind of demonstration. So now if we look really at the archaeological record, as I said, we have very little to chew about Neanderthal art. What we mostly have is objects like these ones, pieces of bones with incisions, nothing like a realistic picture of anything. And of course, the whole discussion is whether these kind of incisions, they are sort of accidental or if they mean something. There are some objects which are more, I would say, convincing. like this. Here it's called a pebble. Actually, it's a fossil. It's a small fossil, which is carved with a cross, and this looks really like something intentional and symmetrical. I'm not sure we can prove any kind of aesthetical sense in the Neanderthals with this kind of object, but certainly an attraction for symmetry. And this aspect of being attracted by symmetry is something that has been commented a lot about Neanderthals, mostly because they produced artifacts like this one, which required a lot of skill to be made so symmetrical. And as a matter of fact, we are not quite sure that this would really change very much their efficiency as tools for butchering, for example. But we do have hand axes like this one, which are almost perfectly symmetrical. Experts in flint snapping say that it's quite difficult to produce this kind of object. It's a big investment. It's not easy. And certainly it means something. Just to remind you what Jean-Pierre Changeux was saying, symmetry, or the attraction for symmetry, and aesthetics are two different things, and actually they are embedded in different parts of our brain. And I must say, with the Neanderthals, probably what we have is a meeting between this attraction for symmetry and a very high level of technical skill. But can we call that aesthetic? I'm not quite sure about that. And again, aesthetics, maybe we should not be too impressed with that, because we know that we are programmed to mate with symmetrical objects, and not just us, but many vertebrates are attracted by symmetry. It's a part of our genome that controls that. Another thing interesting about these hand axes is that there is at least one occurrence where we have here on the cortex of a hand axe a little fossil that has been apparently preserved by the maker of this hand axe. So it's sort of decoration somehow, but it's not made by humans. It's something which is naturally there. And actually in the archaeological record, we have some examples where we see that Neanderthals collected strange objects, things with a special color, a special shape, fossils, for example, special minerals. But again, all these objects are not handmade. They are just found and collected. This index lead me to discuss a second aspect of Neanderthal behavior, is this question of symbolism, which is a different issue than aesthetic or symmetry. And we certainly have Neanderthal burials. There are some which are known in Western Europe, in the Near East, also in Eastern Europe. However, these burials, which seems to have some kind of symbolic meaning, are very simple. They are nothing like what we find later with modern humans. In the period after 40,000 years in Europe or elsewhere in the world, we have burials which are extremely rich in terms of objects, pigments that has been deposited in the burial. We have nothing like that with Neanderthals. We have something which is body-centered. It's just the body which is there. And again, we can wonder what's the meaning of these kind of burials. Interestingly, in this kind of artistic fantasy about Neanderthal burials, you see that the artist has drawn a sort of club here, buried with the dead person. And one of the questions is whether or not we have this kind of objects that has been really deposited in Neanderthal burials. And I must say that most of the time the answer is no. We don't have anything like that. We just have pits that has been refilled with the sediments which was around, and this sediment is full of artifacts, and it's quite common to find artifacts in the refilling of the pit. There is one exception. that has been mentioned by Jean-Pierre, which is quite, I think, interesting, is the case with Cima de los Huesos. So Cima de los Huesos, it's a site in North Spain, which is quite old. We are probably around almost 500,000 years. And it's a shaft in the depths of a cave about half a mile from the entrance of the cave. Actually, it's quite difficult to get there. And in this shaft, about 30 human bodies apparently were thrown. And there is nothing else in this deposit but these human bodies plus some carnivores that apparently fell there by accident. The interpretation of the site by the Spanish colleagues is that this is an intentional deposit of dead bodies. They have a very peculiar demographic profile, and a very intriguing thing about this site is that there is only one stone artifact that has been found in this site. And this object that has been called Excalibur is again, it's an index, and it's a very beautiful index. It's an index made with a very nice material, and we can see probably with this example a case for symbolic behavior in Neanderthal. Now to finish with the different aspects of the possible artistic expression in Neanderthal, there is the question of the pigments. We do have in some sites pigments which have been found. These pigments are usually black pigments. It's manganese dioxide. And sometimes they are shafted, they are shaped in like pencils, or they are blocks like that with some lines. The problem with this is, of course, we don't know really what they were doing with that. Some people have imagined that they have been used for skin decoration, for skin painting. So these guys here who pretend to be Neanderthals, but you see right away that they are not, although they are trying to do something funny with their mouths, have rather sophisticated paintings. It could be something more simple like that. Again, the question is that we don't know if these pigments were used for body ornaments, and we don't know what kind of signification had this behavior, if it ever existed. There is a possibility that has been brought by some, that the pigments that we find in Neanderthal sites or in sites of other groups of hominins were used for some kind of totally utilitarian purpose. And for example, there are experiments showing that mixing pigments with some glue helps to stabilize the glue for hafting some lithics, for example. So, about 40,000 years ago, we have in Europe the emergence of modern humans that look very much like you and I. And they are known by human remains like these ones. It comes from a site called Pestera Cuoase in Romania. There are some also demonstration of this invasion of Europe by modern humans via the archaeological record. And these humans for sure are going to express some kind of art, and Randy White, I'm sure, is going to show you a number of these examples. What's interesting about this process of colonization of Europe by the modern humans is that it occurs probably at least 40,000 years ago by C14 calendar. It's possible that there are industries which could have been made by modern humans older in Europe, but we are not sure because we don't have any fossil humans associated with these industries. But in a site called Willensdorf in Austria, we do have origination assemblages which are close to 39,000 years old by C14 dates. And we were pretty sure that the origination was made by modern humans. Interestingly, at the time when this origination developed in Central and Eastern Europe and later in Western Europe, we do have other lithic assemblages, and at least in one case, maybe two cases, we know that some of these assemblages that were produced at the time of the development of the origination in Europe were made by Neanderthals, by the last Neanderthals. And we have, with the one of these assemblages called the Châteaubriand, Neanderthal remains found in at least 2 different sites in France. The interesting thing about these last Neanderthals that were contemporary with the first modern humans in Europe is that, first of all, we have overlap in time which might be of several millennia, and second, that they apparently produced body ornaments like the one that the modern humans were making and carrying. There was a lot of discussions about the body ornaments found in one of the 2 sites I mentioned, Arcis-sur-Cure. There was different hypotheses. First of all, the possibility that it was a contamination of these layers, but I would say most people today think that they were made by Neanderthals. They were not just traded or found. And of course, I would say the most likely interpretation of these objects is that they were the result of some kind of acculturation of the Neanderthals by modern humans. Again, the question about these objects is it's interesting because it shows that Neanderthals were probably able to produce this kind of things. It's not so surprising because we know they are very crafty at making objects. But now the question is, first of all, can we call this art? It may look aesthetic to us. I'm not sure it's aesthetic for Neanderthal. And more importantly, the question is what the significance of this kind of object. If we look on the side of the modern humans, on the side of the invaders, we know that a long time before they moved into Europe, they were starting to use objects like shells, likely to do body ornaments. And these shells have been first described in a site of South Africa called Blombos, but now we have the same kind of things in North Africa. In 2 months from now, I'm going to be working on the field on a site where we have exactly the same kind of Nassarius, dated around 80,000 years ago. And there is, in the Journal of Human Evolution, a new paper that has been published a week ago about other shells like that found in a site 90,000 years ago in Israel. So there was something going on with the modern humans and the body ornaments. And I think, and I want to finish on that, that these objects are probably more, again, to put on the side of the capacities for symbolism in this population more than on the side of aesthetic. In most of the groups of recent hunter-gatherers where we know these kind of body ornaments made of teeth or shells, we know that these objects have mostly a role for marking the status of individuals within a group or to identify different groups. And I think this was the main function of this in the Paleolithic time also. Clearly, modern humans from the Upper Paleolithic had these objects. It's possible that these objects had the same function in the Neanderthals, but we are not quite sure. In any case, and I want to finish with that, we don't have any example of what we call art in the Neanderthals. Just to show you that I'm not such a bad guy, I'm not trying to dig a ditch between Neanderthals and us. And in fact, I'm for incorporating even much more hominins and non-hominins into our human family. I offer you this picture of Michael a gorilla who lived not far from here some years ago near Stanford. It's a gorilla who learned sign language and was a good painter. And he was able to make a pretty decent portrait of his dog, Apple. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to follow Jean-Jacques Hublin because we agree on most things, which is not always the case in paleoanthropology, as I'm sure you're aware. I'm an anthropologist. Anthropology has a long love-hate relationship with art and with art history, as many of you probably know. We take a broad ethnographic comparative perspective, and I'm going to present some of that tonight. The title image here sort of reflects, I think, often the way that Paleolithic art gets represented in the literature, as if it's some version or some deep, distant root of the Western tradition, which it's almost certainly not. It also provides, I think, a very false picture of context, which we know a lot about. We don't have to imagine, we know a lot about for the Paleolithic record. So I'm going to show you some nice images a little later on. It would be too easy to show you nice images and have you ooh and ah about Paleolithic art. You all have seen photographs of Lascaux and Chauvet and all that, and you'll see some of those in a few minutes. But I want to talk about some problems that we have as scholars interested in the evolution of art, if you like. One of them is the issue of art being somehow integral to our species. And there are a couple of documents in the record that give us trouble. One of them is that, at least in terms of the morphological structure of humans, we have people that we're willing to admit into our species and even into our subspecies, some of us are at least, more than 100,000 years before we have any evidence, even of shells with holes pierced in them. And this raises a rather interesting question then for us. This object, which is one of the earliest representations of some external world object, and I was pleased to hear Jean-Jacques talk about this aspect. It's really here in the vicinity of 35 to 40,000 when we begin to see the first representations of real world objects in other media. We're here at 34,000 in southern Germany, fully 160,000 years after the earliest members of our species in East Africa. This raises for us as evolutionists a rather impressive question. We're 130,000 years before we see these kinds of objects that Jean-Jacques has just shown you. Two things emerge from this. First of all, for us as evolutionists, is art a useful scientific category? And I think anthropology long ago abandoned the idea that art somehow was a useful social scientific category. There's a whole literature in social anthropology that is a critique of art as a social scientific category. Or is it an artifact of the Western tradition, which is the position that I think most anthropologists would take, although by convenience they use the term art. Many of you came here today because you saw art on the program, and I'm sorry to disabuse you of its value, although you're certainly free to disagree with me. Most of us in paleoanthropology talk rather about symbolic representation, which is a mouthful, and it's not as interesting as art, and it doesn't trigger all of that passion in our brains that art does. Is it a less ethnocentric category? Maybe. Is it a cultural invention, or is it mandated by hard wiring? Of course, this is the question that comes out of the fact that anything that we're willing to call art shows up 150 or 170,000 years after the first members of our species. What is the relationship between hard wiring in the brain and the first evidence, the first material evidence for things that we're willing to call symbolic representation? Well, there are a number of ways of thinking about all of this. And I think the record is still sufficiently ambiguous to allow us all to have our way in this. One of them is that the evolution of the capacity for symbolic representation was a gradual process over 2.5 million years, and the record more or less represents neurological changes that allowed for symbolic behavior. A second is, and a far more frequently encountered view, is that this is a very sudden process, and that it occurs somewhere between 100 and 40,000 years ago, long after the first emergence of members of our species, and that it's a rather revolutionary development. And finally, a third point of view, which I prefer to adhere to, is that the capacity evolved a long time ago for the kind of behavior that ultimately shows up in the record that we call art, but that something special was going on in the vicinity of 100 to 40,000 years ago that made it advantageous or even desirable to do some of the kinds of spectacular things that we see in caves or that people were wearing on their bodies. And of course, Jean-Jacques alluded to the fact that one of the really exciting things in human evolution that takes place in that period is the dispersal of anatomically modern humans, ultimately to replace all of these other populations that preceded them. Anthropologists like to be old-fashioned and to think in old-fashioned terms, and I was surprised actually that no one to this point has used the term metaphor. I'd like you to think about metaphors in a second. But the attribution of meaning to things and events in the external world seems to me to be a pretty important part of who we are as modern humans, at least, and it would be nice to be able to see how that plays out as we move back through time. But all of you are aware that there are a whole bunch of processes and concepts that we need to keep in mind when we think about this very complex package. And one of them is the whole notion of perception, which we know has a very important neurological component, but we also know has an extraordinarily powerful cultural component. And I'm here as an anthropologist to try to lend a cultural flavor to some of these questions. How is it that we construct meaning from material experience? Carolyn Bloomer was interested in the visual, and some of you have been very interested in the visual, but what about the material? Because we're not always operating in something that we can consider to be the visual medium. So how do we go from that real world out there with woolly mammoths roaming around and people watching them to the one in which, deep in a cave, you find a miniature sculpture, which we recognize as a woolly mammoth? What is that process anyway? And how does it fit into evolutionary perspectives? Well, I don't have to remind you how important culture is. Culture, in many ways, conditions your very perception of sounds and smells and other kinds of things. I do want to give you some examples that are relevant to our current subject here. And you can read any of this in any basic psychology of visual perception textbook. You know that you don't hear vibrations or feel vibrations in your eardrums, you hear sounds. So you know that perception is very deeply involved, and cultural perception is very deeply involved in immediately transforming what you perceive sensorially into some sort of meaningful experience. But how do we think about all this? How would we best think about the relationship between perception and symbolic representation? Representing what one perceives in nature, for example. And there are lots of terms that have been used. The terms that this symposium has found useful are art and aesthetics. But read, if any of you are trained in art history, you probably had the Jansen textbook. I understand just last week that our art history students at NYU are still suffering through Jansen after all of these years. I think it's in like the 17th edition or something like that, and he's been dead for I don't know how many decades. But how best, what concepts can we forge to understand this record? When does symbolic representation become art? And should we care? As people interested in the evolution of symbolism, should we care? Is art so embedded in our thing that we get lost in the fact that it may not have been the thing about the past at all? And if you've read any amount of ethnography at all, you know that we are actually one of the rare cultural traditions in which there's actually a word for art. And that raises another question. What do we do about cultures that produce things that we call art that don't even have a word for the category? Right? What is this thing, art, anyway? Well, years ago, 50s, George Mills set out to try to define in terms that were appropriate to anthropology the essential qualities of art, and he said that there were two approaches to it. One was in its formal organization, which is usually the approach of traditional art history, and the other was in its metaphorical potential. And I'd like to spend just a little time on metaphor, because I think that's really a critical part of what's going on here. You can see that Mills was no enemy of notions of art. He was trying to make sense of it, and he described it as controlled qualitative experience. But how do we control the qualitative experience of others? How do we evoke for them what we intend in something? Well, often we refer to this as art, and you can see Jansen doing backflips here to try to salvage the concept even in art history. First of all, a word, and then it's art because we call it art, it's an aesthetic object, and you can see that this isn't just an issue for art historians, but you can also see, or for anthropologists, but you can also see that he ends up by, for our purposes, placing museums, churches, and caves in the same category. So there's already a kind of projection, if you will, of things from the Western tradition. These are some of the premises of traditional art history, and you'll be insulted by these if you're an art historian, because they're really a traditional art history. I don't know why we get that version at NYU, but we do. And it's much more about appreciation and connoisseurship than it is about real art history. But you'll recognize all of these things, that art is about genius, it's about urges, it's about fulfilling innate needs. And all of these remain to be situated. Some of you have tried very nicely, I think, to situate these in the brain, and that's great. We should be doing that. But traditionally, none of these things have been situated in a way that makes them really appropriate to a scientific approach. And then, of course, there's all this stuff about different categories of art. Craftsmen make, artists create, right? You've heard that one before. Fine art or pure art is to be distinguished from applied art. Well, what are our Paleolithic people doing? What are those Chauvet people doing? Are they doing fine art? Are they doing pure art? Are they doing applied art if it's magic? Or is it just craft? And what are those pierced teeth? If they're jewelry, are they art? Do we care about them then? How do we include them in our approach to things? Just an example from Jansen. I always pick on poor Jansen. I should probably pick on living people because they can stand up for themselves. But Jansen spent a lot of time writing about, not a lot of time, he spent a page and a half. Well, you know his book, writing about Altamira. And this is a very famous image from Altamira that he wrote about. And this was what he wrote about it. Using terms like wonderful wounded bison, dying animal, collapsed on the ground, vivid, lifelike, keen observation, assured vigorous outlines, subtly controlled shading, bulk and roundness, power, dignity, agony. This is a 13,000-year-old painting which is being made to carry an enormous amount of subjective baggage, right? And I don't mean to pick on him, I just mean to give a sense that there's a very real danger in being affected by places like Altamira in a way that simply allows us to fulfill all of our own cultural expectations and assumptions. Well, this is the real bison from Altamira, and this is its context. And of course, what Jansen doesn't tell you is a whole bunch of stuff he doesn't tell you. You don't want to read all this, but he tells you, it doesn't tell you a whole bunch of stuff, but including the fact that that first of all, the bison is part of a panel with 27 other bison, but secondly, that in and among the animals, the painted animals, are more than 70 engraved animals that are not the same species as the ones that are painted, right? And secondly, it's not on the wall of a cave, as Jansen says, it's on the ceiling, which changes your experience of it rather dramatically. So one of the things that a modern paleoanthropology does first and foremost is to try to, as best as archaeology can, contextualize these things before jumping to these kinds of descriptions that already have interpretation built fundamentally into them. Okay, so well, you all know that anthropology is about other cultures, and that we always disprove people's claims by saying, oh, some culture somewhere in the central desert of Australia does it this way, so that proves that it's not universal. But in many cases, that argument is justified. I'd like to just explore a little bit this business of metaphor, which art historians and Aristotelians have seen as a rather important and interesting aspect. And for me, in much of what is Paleolithic, so-called Paleolithic art, much of it, I think, can be categorized as something that is evocative in a metaphorical way. That is, the images make reference to something that is not inherent in the images. Well, some old things by Lakoff and Johnson, which I think are really good, that show just to what degree metaphors structure our very understanding or grasping of the world around us. The most intangible things we grasp by metaphors that refer to the most tangible things. And I suspect that that's what's going on, right? This falls very nicely into one of the presentations we had this morning, but I beg of you to seek the relationship between the images that you have here and all that emotional stuff that they evoke for you. There is nothing inherent in the image on the upper left that has anything to do with love whatsoever, except in a particular cultural context with a particular set of accepted metaphors, right? And the same thing could be said of the other image itself. So what's that got to do with Paleolithic art? Well, it has a lot to do with Paleolithic art. What's actually being represented on the walls of places like Lascaux and Chauvet? Well, it's hard to know. It's very clear that certain animal species are being selected for. They most often have nothing to do with the animals that are being eaten. They're animals that are being thought about and represented. We often have the associations of particular species in a very structured way. There are something like 16 horses in this panel, many of them underlying this rather large aurochs. And we often overlook, in the sort of dynamism, if you like, of these images, we often overlook the very complicated business of why anybody would do this in the first place. And it's even more complicated now that it's been shown that in Lascaux, all the horses were done first. They went through the entire cave, painted all the horses, and then they inserted the other animals in around them. So what are these relationships? Well, we have those, right? Imagine yourself 20,000 years from now coming on this image, right? Or this one. How's that? We have complicated notions about animals. They're metaphors for certain kinds of things, and I'll spare you all of the sports names of all of the teams in the different conferences. But I think we have to open our minds here and to see many of these images not as representations of what they are, but as representations of very powerful metaphors that these cultures are trafficking in. Think about it another way. Think about it in the way of what animals actually mean to you, right? What is a horse? What does this evoke for you? Someone who's a representative of the Western tradition, someone who's grown up with horses in a particular context. What does that horse actually mean for you? Can you actually see this horse like a Magdalenian 18,000 years ago saw it without the various metaphors and associations we have? I would argue no. I would argue that different cultures, even closely related cultures, have very different relationships to nature that are embedded in the representations of that nature, and I would argue that the Paleolithic is no exception. And if you think Americans are excluded from this, well, there's a very interesting. Go online and look for horses and conflicts with French culture and all sorts of things, because we have ideas about animals and what's appropriate to eat and what's appropriate to paint and what's appropriate to think and what's noble and what's clean and what's not. And while I may not show you these fantastic Paleolithic images, I hope I can get you to think about those images in a way that perhaps you haven't thought about them before. Sorry for the profanity, but I thought this was just too good to pass up. We do have animal metaphors that are very profound and allow us to talk about things that are very difficult and complicated to grasp and to talk about, including conflicts between nations and such matters. Again, I challenge you to find this 2,000 years from now and know what the hell anybody is talking about. All right. To accommodate all of this, I have constructed what I call different cultural logics of representation, and I think we can get at some of those archaeologically. But we have to come to terms with the fact that different cultures have extraordinarily different notions about even what an image is, about its power. When we say an image is powerful, that tends to mean that it's moving somehow. But if you were to talk to a Central Desert Australian about the power of an image, that would be basically the electrical force that it generated when you touched it and what threw you to the ground. Right? The images actually have physical power. Representations are going to feel very different on the walls if they're constructed out of those different views of things. In the San, the southern San from southern Africa, the rock support is a threshold to the spirit world. It's not a surface. You're going to put very different things on that, quote, surface if you're thinking of it as a veil that separates you from a parallel spiritual universe. Right? So I think we need to be really quite careful about projecting art outside of our own particular tradition. And just a final wonderful example from the Inuit, in which all representation has embedded in it the fact that everything in the world is transitory, and that one thing changes into another. These are two views of the same image. You can see with, I think, 9 strokes, this Inuit produced something that is quite extraordinary, a caribou in 2 different poses. Right? And even something as fundamental as realism. There's an old French guy back from the 20s named Georges Luquet, who made a distinction between réalisme intellectuel and réalisme visuel. And he did that because certain ethnographically studied people in Africa were much more content and interested in the image at the right than they were in the image at the left. Why? Because it has more information. It's more realistic. You actually see more of the animal. We're into visual realism. A lot of other cultures are into another kind of realism that we need to be careful about not ignoring. And finally, let me just show you some very nice images from the Grotte Chauvet. But let's keep something in mind while we're doing that. These are deep, dark caves. What is a cave? We have a certain metaphor for caves, even. I often say to my students that if we knew what caves were to Paleolithic people, we'd be halfway to knowing why they were down there and why they were painting what they were painting on the walls 32,000 years ago. A final example I think, to make you even more uncomfortable, which is that this image has been reproduced in a lot of art textbooks recently. It's from Chauvet. It's a particular piece of a particular panel, and it's often described as a frieze of painted horses. When I taught my prehistoric art class at NYU, I had a person who raised horses in the crowd, and she came up after class after she saw this image, and she said, "That's not a frieze of horses. Those 4 horses could never exist in the same space in real life. They're all doing fundamentally different things: fleeing, sleeping, at rest, etc. In fact, it's not a representation of space, of a spatial relationship. It's a representation of time, of one horse in 4 different phases, if you like. Be really careful, I think, about imposing our rules on this distant past. I love this image because if you look at these horses, they're the product literally of tens of hours of work by very accomplished people who are preparing the surfaces. And you may not have seen this image, but it just shows you how wonderfully well preserved Chauvet is. Every last stroke of the tool is preserved on that surface. And then there's the thing to close about the combinations and the associations of things that fall beyond, I think, for the moment, our comprehension. What is the relationship on the same panel between a lion in profile, a bison in profile, and the lower legs and sexual anatomy of a human woman? Right? They're doing some very complicated things based upon very complicated worldviews and very complicated values that I think the very notion of art makes it too easy to ignore. I guess that's the point I'd like to leave you with, is that, as I said before, I could show you wonderful pictures and you'd ooh and ah, but I think it's much more important to begin to think about how to tease something out of these that's faithful to the original people who did them and not simply faithful to the way that we project onto the distant past. I'll leave it there. Thank you.